Good afternoon, class. We're going to get started on chapter 6 and your Principles of Microeconomics textbook. And for the majority of chapter 6, it's talking about maximization. Maximization efficiencies, both for individuals, but in the marketplace. But before we get into the maximization aspect of chapter 6, I want to go back and review just quickly a couple of things that we went through in chapter 5. And one of the main topics in chapter 5, it talked about elasticity. And one of the first ones we talked about was price elasticity of demand. And that's basically a change in the quantity demanded. It's a percent change in the quantity demanded divided by the percent change in price. And they always throw that in, though, the ceteris paribus. It gets to the point that you hear that so much in economics, and I've explained why. We, as economists, we're trying to simplify the complex world that we work in, or actually we live in, and we invoke the ceteris paribus, which means all other things equal, all other things unchanged. It actually gets to the point that you expect economists, one of the first things they do once they get their degree is they go out and get a tattoo that says ceteris paribus. So that's how strongly economists believe in invoking that assumption. And it is one of the main drivers in most of your economic thought and most of your economic theory, even economic analysis. That's the way that economists, all of us as a group, attempt to simplify the complex world again. And when we're talking about PED, or the price elasticity of demand, if the elasticity of demand, price elasticity of demand, less than -1 or greater than 1 in an absolute value, it's what? It's elastic. If price elasticity of demand is equal to -1 or equal to a +1 in absolute value, it's unit elastic. And then again, if it's greater than -1, but less than 1 in absolute value, we're talking about inelasticity, or inelastic price elasticity of demand. And then the authors go into what, I guess, the calculation that most of the professors that I had at Ohio State seemed to think that it was that the calculation that you was probably best fit reality when you're trying to calculate price elasticity of demand, and that's arc elasticity. And you're using, at that point, you're using the average for quantity. So doesn't matter which point you start with, up or lower, doesn't matter. You're going to use the average of that, and then you're going to use the average of the price, and it's going to get you an elasticity of demand, and in this case, price elasticity of demand. It's going to get you one that, again, better or more closely approximates reality. And then the authors get into total revenue, and that's nothing more than, price times quantity. And then they spend a few minutes talking about the determinants of price elasticity of demand, and they talk about availability of substitutes, percentage of household budget, or if you looked at the household budget as a pie chart, you're going to get the biggest slice of the pie, and that's going to be your largest percentage of your household budget. And you're also looking at time horizons. And then we spent just a few minutes talking about price elasticity of income. And so or income elasticity of demand, I guess, is a better terminology. And that's percent change in the quantity and demand of the product divided by the percent change in the household income, or the income of your income, my income, whatever consumer we're talking about. And then they had some cross price elasticities, and then they spent a few minutes talking about the elasticity of supply. So, and as I said at the tail end of chapter 5, sometimes students really struggle with elasticity. And as we move into some more of the I'll say more complex, maybe not necessarily more complicated aspects of microeconomics, but into maybe some of the more complex issues of economics, just you as a academic, or you as a student, or an individual seeking knowledge about whether it's microeconomics or macroeconomics, don't make it any harder than it has to be. It's if you step back as a student, especially, and step back, and even I've stepped back from time to time and actually think through it. And there'll be some things I say on these videos, and I'm thinking, now, does that really make sense? And so I have to take a step back and actually think through some of them. So apply the principles that you're struggling with to everyday life. And we were talking about normal and inferior goods and substitutes and complements, and just relate it to something that you're used to thinking about in ordinary life. And I've always been able to talk students through well, it's like substitutes and complements. I use the example of coffee and tea, and you're going into Starbucks, because it seems like, depending on what part of the country you're in, there's a Starbucks on every corner, and most students really like Starbucks coffee. So unless you're in the state of New York and they just absolutely hate Starbucks coffee, but they have their own version of a coffee kiosk there, and it's, you can, especially when I'm working with students in the state of New York, I still use coffee and tea because it's just a really good example, and it's easy for them to start to kind of grasp these economic concepts. So that's going to kind of wrap us up with chapter 5, kind of a quick little review. And especially when it comes to test time, just think about some of these concepts. And if you get hung up on a question on a test, just take a step back and think your way through it. Say, okay, if I were making a choice this morning and I'm thinking about normal and inferior goods, I'm thinking about substitutes and complements, I'm thinking about calculating price elasticity of demand, how would I go about doing it? And usually you can talk your way through it, especially if you get a pencil and paper out and sketch it and draw it out, shift curves. And it's not as complicated as it seems. And I think students just make the study of, especially microeconomics. Some students grasp macroeconomics easier than micro, but when it comes to microeconomics, don't make it any harder on yourself than you have to. And so chapter 6 starts out talking about the 3 pillars of economic way of thinking. And I don't know how many times we've gone through this, but it never hurts to, and the authors, I think, take the same approach. It never hurts to go over it again. The 3 pillars are, it's opportunity cost, self-interest, which they, talk about optimization. Optimization can take the form of minimization, maximization, depending on what the problem's talking about. And it also takes into account, or one of the other pillars, maybe the 3rd pillar, if you want to look at it, is that of making decisions at the margin. So marginal decisions. And you'll get into this chapter and talking about some marginal decision rules and along those lines. So that's why the authors go over the 3 pillars before we really get started and head down the road. And then they start to move into, and we've talked about competitive market, but they move in and they talk for a few minutes about the competitive market. And you could call a competitive market a free market. You can call it an unfettered market. You can call it whatever terminology you want. But in economic thought, or in the theory of economic thought, a competitive market guides the best use of our scarce resources. And it gets us the highest value usage, or as the book says, the biggest bang for the buck. And that's one of the underpinnings of a competitive market. And then they move into they group people as, 2 groups of maximizers. And you've got consumers, and consumers are, trying to maximize marginal benefits, and they're trying to maximize utility, the benefit of the satisfaction of, consuming a good or service. If you're on the business side of the house, so you're looking at, business units, firms, corporations, they're trying to maximize profits, especially what they talk about, and we'll get into it maybe a little later in the text, economic profits. And business firms usually are looking at total revenue minus total cost, and they're also talking about economic cost at that point, because there are some foregone opportunities. So there are always going to be some foregone opportunities, especially in the business world, based on the decision that typically it's the CEO or the COO or the CFO or of a given company or corporation are making, but they're always concerned again with one of the pillars of economic thought, and that's opportunity cost. They're also concerned about the second pillar of economic cost. They're concerned about self-interest and maximization. And lo and behold, surprise, they're concerned about that third pillar. They're talking about making decisions at the margin. And both groups get the greatest value from scarce resources if they function in the marginal area of that decision-making process. And from a society perspective, it gets the greatest benefit to overall society. And when we're talking about economic profit, again, we're talking about total revenue minus total cost. And then the book talks about a constraint, and they define constraint as a limit on the choices or resources that are available. And if you think about anybody's decision-making choice, and I think I made the comment maybe in the very first chapter, we all have unlimited wants. You have unlimited wants. I certainly have unlimited wants. And there are very few people in the world. If you look at the global aspect, there are very few people in the world that don't have some kind of an unfilled want or an unfilled need. You think Elon Musk doesn't have unfilled wants? Do you think the richest guy in the world doesn't have unfilled wants? Absolutely, they do. And so everybody has a constraint. My constraint is my disposable income. Disposable income and number of hours in the day to work. Your constraint may be, as a student, that my guess is it's going to be disposable income. And when you're talking about firms, go back to the factors of production. What are they? Labor, capital stock, natural resources. Most importantly, at least to most firms, it's land. And then you've got the production process, technology, and how efficient it is. And lastly, you've got entrepreneurship that affects the technology of the production process. So all firms have unlimited wants. So everybody has a constraint. And then they describe net benefit. And that's the total benefit of an activity minus its opportunity cost. Firms, again, maximize profits. Consumers maximize utility. And that's the basis of a lot of economic choice. And both firms and consumers are acting as what most textbooks will term economic agents. And if you've, I doubt many of you have taken my health economics class at Fisk, but if you had, we talk about, in the healthcare world, we talk about this principal agent dilemma, and that's ties back into asymmetric information and some other things. But there's always some type of economic agent functioning out there that is trying to optimize some kind of self-interest. And they talk about, and again, the text, I think the text does a fairly good job in kind of laying this out and helping the student to understand as they kind of move through this maximization process. And they discuss marginal thinking replaces calculus. And they make a comment in there that calculus scares off more potential or future economists than anybody else does or any other thing does, because economists are just terrified of or at least most individuals that you find, especially as an undergraduate, that don't want to move down the road toward either a major or minor in economics. It's calculus that scares them off. So this marginal way of thinking is an opportunity for students that helps them understand economic principles and concepts without going into the calculus piece of it. And next, as they kind of move through this continuum of definitions, they talk about marginal benefit, the amount by which an additional unit of an activity increases its total benefit. Think about you go into McDonald's and you sit down and you have a Big Mac. and that Big Mac is, cost at X number, it's a price at X number of dollars. And you haven't eaten all day, and it's like 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You go and you have that first Big Mac, and man, that thing, you say, that is great. And then you decide, well, I'm going to have another Big Mac. And you pull out your wallet, and you take out your money, you pay for it, and you sit down and you eat that Big Mac, and it's really good, but it doesn't nearly give you the satisfaction of that first Big Mac. And then the guy at McDonald's, the manager, comes out and says, hey, I've got some extra Big Macs back here, and we're running a special on them. And if you've already had 2, but if you want another one, I'll sell it to you for $1. And you think, oh my God, a Big Mac for $1. And you pull out your $1 and you give it to them, and you manage to get through about half of that Big Mac. And after that, it's like, I just can't go any more of that Big Mac. And that's what we're talking about here when we're talking about marginal benefit. That it decreases over time. No matter what price is, you can only consume so much of a given good or service and get the same level of benefit as you consume more of it. Another example that I usually see is talking about somebody working out in the gym, and bottles of water. You finish your workout, and you're hot and sweating, and you're just drained, and you're thirsty, and you walk by the water bottle machine, and it's $1 for a bottle of water. You get that first one, and it's probably the best bottle of water you've ever had. And you're still a little thirsty, and you give them another $1, and you get another bottle of water, and you drink it, and it is really good, but not nearly as good as that first one. And then you think, I'm dehydrated, and I probably need a bottle of water to drink going home. And so you give them that third $1, and you get your water. And again, kind of like the Big Mac, you get about halfway through that bottle of water, and you think, man, this is just not doing it. And again, we're talking about marginal benefit. That's why they say it's the amount by which an additional unit of an activity increases its total benefit. While it may be increasing that total benefit, it's increasing it kind of at what you would call increasing at a decreasing rate. And then we talk about marginal cost, the amount by which an additional unit of an activity increases its total cost. So if you're a producer and you're making coffee cups, you're making, you've got a whatever they call the wheel that you make pottery on, and you're making these coffee cups and you're selling them, and you're talking about how does that marginal cost increase each time you bring additional coffee cup to market. So that's the marginal cost side. And again, it's the marginal cost is going to change each time you bring another unit to market. And then they get down to finally the marginal decision rule. And this is the thing. And when you read through the text and you get to that marginal decision rule, you're thinking, man, this is great. I didn't have to do any calculus to get to here. But this marginal decision rule is that you think this is just common sense, because you're thinking if the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, you do it. If the marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost, you don't do it. And that's a marginal decision rule. And it's a decision rule that once you get to it, it's kind of like if you've ever watched The Wizard of Oz, and right down toward the end, Dorothy and Tin Man Scarecrow, and I forget the other guys. I forget what the other one was, but they're waiting to get back home, and they're waiting for the great and powerful Oz, and they're expecting this great and magical being to come forward and provide them a way home. And they pull the curtain back, and there's this guy back there, this little old guy back there, and all he's doing is playing with the machine and making noise, and it is a deflation to them because they were expecting something wild and magical. And that's kind of the way that you sometimes feel at the end of the day when you're studying microeconomics. Build it up, talking about marginal benefit, marginal cost. And then when they get to the marginal, decision rule, you sit back and you say, man, that's just common sense. And that's why I say, don't get all tied up and hung up with a lot of the economic terminology and concepts because a lot of it is common sense. Just again, think your way through it. And marginal benefit curves for virtually all activities slope downward. And that's because each unit you add to it on the marginal benefit, it's going to, that the magnitude of that marginal benefit is going to decrease as you go down. And they have mentioned multiple times in the textbook, just like in chapter 5, don't get economic concepts, because if you think about it, the law of demand says the demand curve slopes downward. The law of supply says the supply curve slopes upward. And if you think about those concepts, what is the slope of the curve? It's the change in y divided by the change in x. Change in vertical divided by the change in the horizontal, which is different. And they pointed it out on more than one occasion in chapter 5. And, we've talked about it in these videos, or I've talked about in these videos. Don't get the slope of those curves mixed up, especially with, price elasticity of demand, because we're talking about there a percentage change. Here, we're just talking about a change. So be careful when you're talking about slopes of the curve and percentage change in something, because remember, percentage change, if you remember the formula from chapter 5, it's the ending value minus the beginning value divided by the beginning value. And as I told you in chapter 5, you can rearrange terms and play with math magic. And all of a sudden, what do you have? If you take the ending value divided by the beginning value and subtract 1, that's going to get your percentage change. And that is definitely different from the slope of the curve. And then they jump in, they go through the marginal benefit decision process again. And if marginal benefits greater than marginal cost, you do more of it. If marginal benefits less than marginal cost, you do less of it. And if marginal benefit equals a marginal cost, it identifies the maximum net benefit. And that is key to this particular chapter, striving for the maximum net benefit. And then they bring in the idea of dead weight loss. It's a loss in net benefits resulting from a failure to carry out an activity at the most efficient level. Can imply an opportunity loss. What else have we talked about in one of the earlier chapters where we talk about one of the two key assumptions in one of the earlier chapters talked about efficient technology and efficient production process. Think back to your production possibility curve. What were the two caveats to that? All your resources had to be fully employed, and you had to be using efficient technology. Technology had to be maximized, and the efficiency of that technology had to be maximized. So again, we're starting to tie some of these concepts, at least in theory, starting to tie some of them together. And lastly, the marginal decision rule states, and I think this is what they've been driving to in the first part of this chapter, marginal decision rule states if the marginal benefit equals the marginal cost, then you maximize net benefits. It makes a difference between total benefits and total cost as large as possible, and that's what maximization means. That's going to kind of wind up the introduction into maximum net benefits and marginal cost and the marginal decision rule. And when we come back, we're going to take some of these concepts and start applying them to the marketplace. So I will be back in a few minutes and we'll jump into the second segment of chapter 6. Talk to you later.